training recommendations are usually based on what works well for most people most of the time. However, each individual is slightly unique and responds slightly differently to different types of training. In this video, we will cover how much muscle growth can differ between lifters and how trainees may be able to individualize their training to achieve greater gains over time. Hypothetically, let's say we had multiple thousands of people follow the exact same training program for 1 year, which was designed for muscle growth. Although the training program was the same, not every single participant would see the same magnitude of muscle growth. Most lifters would see a similar amount of muscle growth, which we would expect. But a small number of lifters would experience significantly more muscle growth than average, and a small number would experience significantly less than average. This was seen in this study, which put almost 600 healthy, untrained men and women through a biceps and triceps training program for 12 weeks. Although the same training program was completed, muscle growth outcomes were not exactly the same for all participants. This graph shows the number of people who experienced various different magnitudes of bicep growth. Most people experienced pretty decent biceps growth, around a 10 to 20% increase in cross-sectional area. However, there was a small fraction of people who experienced no muscle growth and even slight reductions in muscle mass. And on the other end of the spectrum, there were a few people who saw biceps growth of more than 50%. This is an example of the bell curve relationship that we see regarding the individual response to training. Most people experience the typical average response that we would expect and make recommendations for. However, there are people who are less responsive to training and experience less muscle growth. And on the other side of the spectrum, there are people who are more responsive to training and experience more muscle growth than average. So, just like any other physiological trait, there is likely to be substantial differences in how people respond to resistance training when comparing the lower and upper ends of the spectrum. So, why does muscle growth differ so much between lifters? Well, this is probably largely due to our genetic makeup. Like we saw in the previous study, even the exact same training protocol resulted in wide variability between subjects. And yes, there could have been other external variables influencing these outcomes, such as effort, sleep, and nutrition, but this probably doesn't explain the huge variation that we see at a population level. So quite clearly, there are people who naturally, due to their genetic makeup, build more muscle mass than others without necessarily training better or harder than others. While we all know about the genetic freaks who achieve incredible muscularity, the opposite population also exists that we don't hear much about. These are the lifters who try just as hard as everyone else, but don't seem to make much notable progress over time. In the research, these are known as non-responders. Although we sometimes see people who achieve no notable muscle growth from a training intervention, this doesn't necessarily mean that they cannot build any appreciable muscle mass over time. First of all, trainees may simply require longer time frames to achieve significant muscle growth. This was demonstrated in this study, which looked at muscle growth from resistance training over a 24-week time frame in elderly adults. After 12 weeks, the subjects saw about a 0.9 kilogram gain in muscle mass on average. And as expected, there was also variability in muscle growth, with some subjects seeing more or less gains than others, shown with the grey minimum and maximum lines. Then, after 24 weeks, muscle growth continued to increase slightly on average, with the minimum and maximum also shifting in a positive direction. So, some of the subjects who may be considered non-responders after the initial 12 weeks could now be considered responders, simply from training longer. As we train for longer periods of time, the proportion of non-responders decreases until basically everyone achieves some notable muscle growth. And second, those considered non-responders may respond better to slightly different forms of training than the norm. This idea was proposed in this research review, exploring the topic of non-responders for various different training goals. The authors concluded that it is very unlikely for someone to be a true non-responder, meaning they exhibit no adaptations from training. Furthermore, those who may not see great results from a particular training method may see better results from manipulating certain variables. So, how can we adjust variables to achieve the best muscle growth results specifically for us? Well, there are a few primary variables that we can manipulate to best suit our individual requirements. The first variable which trainees tend to respond quite differently to is volume. In the context of hypertrophy training, volume can be defined as the total number of hard sets performed per muscle group per week. Based on the current evidence, the volume-hypertrophy relationship probably looks something like this. As we perform more volume, we see greater muscle growth, assuming all other factors are equated. However, we see diminishing returns with higher volumes, meaning each additional set is less additionally hypertrophic. For the average lifter, significant diminishing returns probably start to become apparent after around 20 weekly sets per muscle group. However, these numbers may vary substantially between lifters. Someone who is highly responsive to training may see diminishing returns after training a muscle with only around 10 sets per week. And on the other side of the spectrum, someone who is less responsive to training may see diminishing returns from training a muscle with 30 sets per week. So, those who see great muscle growth with low to moderate volume training may simply be good to average responders. However, if you find that you may be seeing less muscle growth than average, it may be worth experimenting with higher volume training to see how you respond. Another variable that can have substantial individual variation are the rep ranges we train with. On average, we can achieve similar muscle growth across a large spectrum of rep ranges and loads, as long as we are training close to failure. The overall research suggests that muscle growth can be equally achieved with as low as around 5 reps up to around 30 reps. However, just because muscle growth on average is similar across these rep ranges, it doesn't mean that you will respond exactly the same across all of these ranges. This study explored the individual response to training with different rep ranges. Trainees performed 3 sets of leg press, leg extensions, leg curls, and calf raises 3 times per week for 24 weeks. Half the subjects trained with 8 to 12 reps for the first 12 weeks, followed by training with 27 to 31 reps for the following 12 weeks. And the other half performed the same rep ranges in the opposite order. After the initial 12 weeks and after 24 weeks, thigh muscle growth was very similar between groups, as we would expect. However, the individual differences between subjects were not all the same. These data points show the high responders after the first 12 weeks, meaning those who saw greater than average muscle growth. Once they transitioned to the second training phase using different rep ranges, most of them saw less muscle growth compared with the first phase. And on the other hand, this graph shows the low responders after the first 12 weeks, meaning those who saw less muscle growth than average. Once they transitioned to the second training phase using a different rep range, most of them saw much greater muscle growth. This study suggests that while muscle growth can be equally achieved across a large range of reps and loads, individuals will probably respond better or worse to more specific rep ranges within this spectrum. Therefore, it may be worth experimenting with different rep ranges within this spectrum to find out what works best for you. The next variable that we can manipulate to tailor our training is exercise selection. While muscle growth can be achieved using many different exercises, some exercises may be slightly more or less effective for each trainee. This may be a result of differences in anatomical structure. It is quite obvious that there is substantial variation in bone structure as seen by people of different heights, different limb lengths, and bone shapes. However, there is also muscular anatomical variation in terms of muscle attachment sites and muscle fiber orientation. Because of this variability, this research review suggested that certain exercises may be more or less hypertrophic for each individual. One exercise may be slightly more stimulative for one person, but less stimulative for another. Although this may be true, it is very difficult to know which exercises are most effective for each individual lifter, because we cannot see our exact muscle anatomy from the surface of our body. Obviously, we should use the general human anatomy models to develop a general list of effective exercises, but to find the most effective exercises for you, we need to rely more on sensations. This includes feedback such as the mind-muscle connection during a set, the muscle pump after a set, and muscle soreness in the following days after a workout. Experiencing more of these sensations with certain exercises is probably a good sign that the exercise is effectively training that particular muscle. While these are not direct measures of muscle growth, they can help lifters find which exercises tend to provide a better stimulus for them. And the last variable that lifters may respond differently to is frequency, meaning how many times per week a muscle is trained. In general, we find that higher frequencies tend to result in slightly superior muscle growth, even with total weekly volume equated. However, there is some evidence showing that lifters may respond differently to higher versus lower frequencies. This was seen in this study, which explored the effects of training with a higher versus lower frequency. Trainees performed 3 sets of leg extensions in the 9 to 12 rep range to failure, 2 to 3 times per week with one leg, and 5 times per week with the other leg. After 8 weeks, trainees each experienced different results. Some saw greater quad growth from the higher frequency protocol, while others saw greater growth from the lower frequency protocol. For example, this trainee saw superior growth with the high frequency training, while this trainee saw superior growth from the low frequency training. However, it should be noted that this study didn't equate volume between legs, so the results may be a result of differences in volume rather than frequency. In either case, this study at least provides a hypothesis that individuals may actually find that higher or lower frequencies result in greater gains over time. Again, there is no specific way to work out which muscles respond best to which frequencies for each lifter. The only way is to start with the general recommendations and use trial and error from there. So to summarize this video, let's establish some practical recommendations. First, we should understand that there can be a substantial difference in muscle growth from any given training protocol. Most people respond similarly, but there are people who see much greater muscle growth than average and others who see much less muscle growth than average. However, with enough time and effort, almost everyone can usually see substantial muscle growth over time. Furthermore, lifters respond slightly differently to each training variable. So if you find that you aren't seeing the best results from a specific training protocol, it may be worth adjusting some variables to better suit you as an individual. First, we can manipulate volume. In general, more volume tends to result in superior muscle growth, but some lifters may need more volume than others for maximal growth. So if you find that your current volume isn't producing significant gains, then it may be worth increasing volume. Second is rep ranges. On average, hypertrophy can be equally achieved across a large spectrum of rep ranges and loads, but some people, and potentially some specific muscle groups, may experience greater growth from slightly higher or lower ranges. So trainees may want to experiment with different rep ranges to see what provides the best indicators of muscle growth for each muscle group. Another variable which can see individual variation is exercise selection. There are no best exercises for each muscle, but some exercises might be slightly more effective than others for each individual. This is due to anatomical differences in muscle and bone structure between people. Therefore, lifters may want to experiment with different exercises for each muscle group to find what tends to promote the best stimulus. And lastly, trainees may see variable results with different frequencies. For most lifters, higher frequency training seems to promote slightly superior muscle growth, but some lifters may see greater benefits from a lower frequency. So overall, most guidelines and research aims to find what works best for most people on average. So this should be used as a starting point, and trainees can individualize their routine from there based on their response to training. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.